Every week in my heart, and in the hearts of those across the Commonwealth, it is Transportation Week. And hey, there are allegedly no slow zones anywhere on the MBTA train lines right now. But there's a wide world of transportation options and issues here in Massachusetts, and we're here to get into some of those with a legislative guide. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Rep. Bill Straus of the 10th Bristol District and House Chair of the Joint Committee on Transportation since 2011. Representative, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So we're chatting on Friday, the 13th of December, hopefully not jinxing any of the transit projects we talk about today. And not only is the end of the year careening closer in general, but so is the end of your tenure as a state representative. You aren't seeking re-election, new year, new hobbies. Where is your head at after 32 years in the House?
Well, I had always promised myself a few things. And first of all, I'll say how grateful I am to my district constituents who've given me this opportunity for the past 32 years. I never had a timeline in mind when I started out. It certainly was not as long as 32 years, but I became comfortable with the position. The constituents obviously became comfortable with me. I always felt I was making progress. But one of the things I always promised myself was I wanted to leave the position while I still loved it and not be, I hate sports metaphors, but they do come in handy. That guy who's sitting on the bench, doesn't have knees anymore, maybe can't hit the fast pitch anymore. I wanted to leave while I still enjoy it. And also because there are a number of major projects, I think, in the region and in the state, I wanted to give somebody new a chance to start out, develop experience in the job and influence, frankly, among colleagues, so they could see some of these longer term projects that we're just beginning to see on the horizon. So all these things came together, plus good health and grandchildren who live in the same town as I do, and it just felt right and still does.
I was going to say you could have held out for at least another 2 years if you wanted to fulfill a Supreme Judicial Court term tenure rule, I think. You could have made it there. But I mean, is there a project for you that sort of illustrates what you would hope for a successor, thinking about something that maybe right when you came in was sort of burbling up that you've got to see be either fulfilled or that you'd like to hand off? Is there something that feels like a project that's been an arc of your career?
I should have mentioned that during the last term, some regionally significant to my part of the state projects were completed, chief among them South Coast Rail, which restores for the one region of the state that doesn't have a spoke in the hub toward Boston, and that would be the South Coast, restoring that commuter rail connection that was given up in the 1950s. That's a project many people have worked on, myself included. I would never be among those who say that they did something alone, although I probably have had and may have colleagues who like to describe things in terms of the solo role. But what I like to think of it as is at different times, particularly with South Coast Rail, when critical decisions about advancing the project or not advancing the project were on the drawing board or on the decision desk, I've had the ability to help out and be influential. And so South Coast Rail, because it's been pending for nearly all the 30 years I've been in office, seeing that start riding recently on the restored lines from South Station down to downtown New Bedford station on the waterfront or next to the waterfront really was important to me. But coming up, we have, and this is wider than just my part of the state, we have some important bridge projects, including obviously the Cape Bridges, where funding, and I don't mind talking about what I think might be the impact of the next administration in Washington due to take office just about 5 weeks from now. Clearly in the news also is the Alston Brighton project for the Turnpike. They all have their own quirky little names, but I think very important out there are things like the Red and Blue Line connector, adding passenger rail, and I now shy away from the term commuter rail. I like people to think in terms of passenger rail because the whole way in which I believe we will come to understand in the future of that kind of rail is that we don't necessarily follow the traditional model of commuter rail, which is you bring people from the outer rings or outer areas into a central core location, like exists now in terms of the way the routes are designed into Boston. And then late in the day or later in the day, you bring them back out. Passenger rail to me suggests that people move in both directions throughout the day. So we think in terms of the infrastructure being able to provide enhanced capacity to move people in the ways that they travel now.
So, Rep, the last time that I remember talking to you at some length was in that strange period of the pandemic where it looked like everything was about to open up. It was before the first of the variants came down, and we were talking about South Coast Rail. And one of the things that came up when we were chatting about this, one, you were hopeful. You were also a little frustrated by some of the speed of the project, the communication around the project. But you were talking about the way that even in that first year of the pandemic, we had seen changes to the ways that we had talked about why we'd need public transportation. The idea that it might not just be something to get you from home and work, but also that it's part of what knits together a vibrant downtown region, a local area that makes it easy to bop between things. So I'm curious, first off, since then, how are you feeling about the sort of progress and rollout of South Coast Rail? It's happening, but did it happen the way you had hoped it would at that time?
Look, for any major construction or capital project like that, in excess costing $1 billion, there are always supply disappointments, construction disappointments, management disappointments. We had bits and pieces of all of those things. I think they've been corrected during the tenure of Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, so that overseeing what is officially called commuter rail, even though I don't like the term, we have, I think, a great general manager at the T. And so management questions, I think, have largely been resolved. He's brought in a very good team of people around him. We did have, with a particularly important switching mechanism for safety reasons, a delay in, I won't name the international manufacturer, but a delay in that, citing problems that occurred with construction of one of the stations. Those things happen. They're frustrating no end. But the fact that we're doing high speed testing now, and the testing now is at the full speed in stretches of just under 90 miles an hour. And I can say it's a different experience riding a 90-mile-an-hour train through parts of Massachusetts. So, yes, that was frustrating, but we're here now. And when revenue service with passengers starts in the spring, probably of 2025, I think people will quickly forget.
So, as we mentioned, thinking about the pandemic, that's kind of the last leg of your tenure as House Chair of the Transportation Committee here is during this extremely odd, volatile time in terms of who's going where, why are they going where, can they go there in the way that they would like to. So what has that meant as kind of a cap on your philosophy of why we need different types of transportation?
My philosophy is that there isn't a single mode that makes sense for all of the public. And so that means we will still be dependent on the road and bridge system, the train system, or I should say the public transit system, which is in four segments actually, what is now called commuter rail. I hope eventually just passenger rail as a terminology. Public transit includes buses. It's administered regionally by the RTAs, but also within the core Boston area by the T. The subway system, which has its own all day back and forth demand in its schedules. It's more like what I would like to see envisioned for passenger rail. So, more than just the subway system. And Ferries. I have found in this administration, and it's reflected in our budget appropriation, a real need which hasn't fully been realized, but gets better all the time for ferries. You only have to go to as close as the New York City area, but most people often think immediately of Washington State and the Seattle area, where ferries are a part of the public transit system. And when you look at Boston Harbor, and how close the marine trip is to both North Shore and South Shore areas. And some exist, very much so, but I think it can be expanded and also transiting just within the harbor itself. I predict more connections out to Logan, more commuter connections within parts of the city. So ferries, I think, is a coming public transit component. I didn't mean to leave out aeronautics, but we don't really think of moving people daily by air, but Massport and its assets in Worcester, Concord area, I know they hate being mentioned or even known to have a great airport there, but there's a reality from, for nothing else, safety alternatives for planes out there, and of course Logan itself. But I don't include aeronautics as public transit for these kind of discussions.
Potentially very hot take. We'll find out after this airs, so to speak. Do you remember the first big fight over transportation that you got into?
Well, that I got into for sure. When I was sworn in, pretty much the first, it was among the very, very first bills that I filed, had to do with more in this part of the state, an entity that many people are familiar with, the Steamship Authority, which for decades has moved people to Nantucket and the Vineyard. New Bedford had been a historic part of the authority for various reasons, good and bad. It was removed from the authority in the early 1960s. It's not that I recall because I wasn't around, but that's my understanding of the history. I wasn't around as a public official, but I filed a bill to restore New Bedford as a voting member of the authority with the goal, and I was very explicit about this, of having the port become a connection again to the islands, if for no other reason than to reduce traffic on the Cape. I've had some interesting allies in that and not surprising enemies. We were successful in that as a group. I don't want to take sole credit for the success, but New Bedford has a voting seat now on the authority. We have licensed service, high speed ferry service from New Bedford to both islands. I think that licensee does very well. I would expect, although I haven't pushed this in more recent years, but I expect somebody else will note again, why aren't cars moving to the islands? They hate that discussion. You will guaranteed get reaction to that. I hope you do. I think the discussion should take place in terms of, again, taking some cars off bottleneck areas, not to mention the bridges themselves, out to the Cape. All you have to do is a license plate search, walk around the parking lots in New Bedford, and you'll see that during the high season, most of the cars that end up with people going to the islands have plates from states like Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. So they come right by here. But I think it's a good transportation alternative for everyone as well. That was a big fight. It was dramatic. We had colleagues unhappy with each other, but ultimately an agreement was worked out. And I recall it was Jane Swift as acting governor who ended up signing the legislation that puts us in that position today, where New Bedford is an important component of how the Steamship Authority operates.
Pleased to report I had a friend just over the last summer successfully take the steamship, I think, from New Bedford to elsewhere on the Cape and Islands, and she made it there in one piece. I'm not sure if this is exactly the way to ask it, but do you think you've had or are in the middle of your last big Massachusetts transportation fight right now? We are in a moment of pretty substantial crisis and concern over the cost of what it takes to maintain the system, what maybe should have been spent on funding the system? Or do you think you've had a previous blowout that comes to mind more as a major fight recently?
Financing and funding transportation is an issue that is never going to go away. We will resolve pieces of it from time to time, and then it'll come up again. A former co-chair of mine from the Senate, who's still very much involved in transportation issues, Tommy McGee from Lynn, when he and I were co-chairs, I remember at any number of meetings and press events, him pointing out, and he may still be saying it, every year is transportation year. And I've always felt that's right. You've probably noticed in covering the State House that we may take up a major issue, feel that we've done something significant, and we have, and then it's more of a back burner issue for at least a few years because people want to see how that played out. Transportation doesn't have that luxury. So the debate over transportation, I predict, will never go away. I am a member of the governor's appointed task force on financing. We'll see where that recommendation document goes. I may be the only member of that task force, some 20 people, who's actually voted and then gone home to explain and defend increasing taxes. You could call it revenue, but taxes, increasing what people pay to help support, in part, the transportation system.
About the funding situation, legislators in 2000 passed a forward funding law requiring the MBTA to operate on an annual balanced budget. So revenue there would be generated through fares, the state sales tax, and assessments on local communities served by the T. But transit groups have long critiqued the system for tightly capping those revenue options, leaving the state often needing to reimburse the T for costs not covered by those revenues. So, Representative, what about how the T is funded?
There's often a comment from a few people about a significant, what I think was a significant thing we did in the year 2000 or roughly 2000 on changing the way in which the MBTA is funded and prepares its budget. And that's under the phrase forward funding. For some reason, it's become stylish for some commentators or advocates or both to say that when the legislature passed forward funding, that it was a failure. It was a huge success. What was in place prior to 2000 with regard to financing the MBTA was they never prepared a budget. They simply ran their operations, and at the end of the fiscal year, they tallied it up. And like at the end of a meal at an expensive restaurant, they would send the bill over to the legislature and say, here's what we spent last year, pay up. Forward funding said, and requires by law now, that they actually engage in a budget process, prepare a budget for the future, the next fiscal year, and indicate where that money was coming from. So they went on a forward looking budget. It sounds so obvious, but it wasn't prior to the year 2000. Now, the other thing we did was we dedicated a portion of the sales tax that everyone in the state pays, whether they use the T or not, to the T. And for some reason, people say, well, the legislature didn't anticipate that the sales tax would not do as well as they thought. Well, it brings in to the T roughly $700-800 million a year, which is significant for even that organization.
So the suite of options, and obviously on the transportation funding task force, you're limited in what you're able to talk about because you're still in the middle of these discussions. You have a December 31st deadline that I assume you are all looking forward to as much as college student pounding Red Bull right before a final deadline in college. I don't know if you're going to submit something right before the deadline or if you're going to give yourselves a few days of wiggle room, but can you lay out a little bit how the thinking has either evolved over the course of this transportation task force or was already evolving about what possible revenue sources you had to play with. The Fair Share Amendment obviously is a new addition to the toolkit, so to speak, but how has that changed the math? Has it not changed the math? I am leery to bring up the fact that the gas tax is going to be a much more uncertain element of the puzzle if we end up actually phasing out internal combustion vehicles. How are you thinking about the package of options available to you?
For transportation purposes, whether it's for long-term projects or operating funds for the agencies. And distinctions ultimately have to be made to both approaches as to how you get the money. You're still going to need multiple sources. So we refer to the gas tax, which is the traditional way the federal government and every state in the country has looked to fund transportation projects because think of it really as a user fee or a user tax. You drive more, you pay more. And that was, in a sense, the genius. If you want to pay less, either drive less or drive a more efficient engine.
Well, tell me more about that.
A change has occurred to the extent that the fleets, vehicles out there, commercial and private, are going to electric. They're doing it for different reasons, climate being one obvious one, efficiency in terms of the engines and the maintenance required, another one, just as somebody who owns two of these vehicles, plug-in hybrids. Anyway, I use both, find it very effective as an option. But it's not that gas tax revenue right now is shrinking. What we're seeing in Massachusetts and most other states is it's becoming flat. So we're not seeing the growth rates. What has sustained it as level is the fact that people are driving more with those same vehicles, more mileage being consumed. So we're getting about $600 million a year. I hate to get into all these breezy numbers, but gas tax is and always will remain a significant part of the revenue.
Well, that sounds like there might be another story there.
In terms of the task force, the diversity of people from backgrounds, organizations, entities that are participating, everyone seems to have a favorite choice. So that collides right away. Some people have what I would call other policy interests that affect the financing choice that they like the most. Ultimately, it is going to be a legislative and gubernatorial decision. The task force has no legal authority to implement any of these. So it's the force of the ideas and how well they're articulated that makes the end product or the work product of the task force critical. It will end up identifying a number of these options, making a case, linking them perhaps to these other priority issues like climate change and how do we deal with it because the transportation sector is so much a part of the carbon output into the air. And that is not just in terms of gas engines, but electrification of the public transit fleet, the trains moving off from diesel. I won't go into at this point the complicated issues that remain unknown to do that, not least of which is where is the electric capacity to run the trains that now run on diesel. But I don't think there'll be a single recommendation if I've gauged correctly what I've observed in the meetings to date. And as I say, it's going to be the quality of the description, but then following it in settings like this, how people describe why they think one or the other is critical.
Can you elaborate a little bit?
The ultimate deciders will again be the legislature. And as I say, probably the only member of the task force who's not just talked about it, but voted for it and then defended it. Because some votes are easy. Votes when you ask people to pony up more is always harder. But I certainly, in my case, did it successfully. And what I say to people, particularly with transportation funding, is even if you don't use public transit as an example, and you say, why is so much money going to support these public transit options? I just drive on the road. Everyone who rides the train or the bus or the ferries takes cars off the road And apart from any environmental benefit, they're also reducing the traffic. So you should smile. If you're driving up, I'll give an example. If you're driving up Route 24 towards Boston from the south, a drive I regularly take, and you look over and you see the trains heading into Boston in the morning, you should smile because that's a ton of people that aren't driving next to you and slowing down your ride. So maintaining all pieces of the system helps all the modes. When money goes to a bridge and you ride the train, you should be happy. We are, it sounds corny, a commonwealth. And the idea that we have shared interests and shared responsibilities is something I hope people do not forget.
Well, you teased earlier the concept of, well, it's not just that you'll be leaving office, but on the federal level, somebody else will be coming into office with very different ideas about public transit, trains in general, fuel efficiency standards, all of this. Can you tell me how you're reading the potential of a Trump presidency on Massachusetts, which has really spent a lot of time emphasizing the importance of a functional public transit system?
So my feeling on that, and it's no better than any other citizen ultimately, is that while Massachusetts has done quite well in terms of assistance from the federal government in the transportation area, helping out with major projects, some of the major projects that people identify are in progress here. And I'm thinking especially about the Cape Bridges and their need. Those are federal assets. They belong to the Army Corps of Engineers. Yet the expectation is that other parts, other than the Army Corps, meaning US DOT, funding will need to get those bridges replaced, plus cost a lot of money at the state level. The likelihood that they'll be under construction during the next 4 year term of the next presidency is unlikely, but it's very important, I would think, for Massachusetts, at least transportation planners, to be thinking in terms of keeping projects alive, getting the permitting done, and to the extent we can identify projects that assist things like that, whether it's ramp areas, access roads, infrastructure on our transit system, to the extent we can get pieces of those done with 100% state funding, we should be thinking in terms of that. Smaller projects, but all as part of the framework of continuing work on the big projects. It's just prudent, I think, to think in terms of the federal government having less of a direct funding role during that next term. And that's how we should be planning our projects.
And I think the very last thing is, you won't be leaving the transit world, presumably, but is there a current trend in either general transportation, public transportation, technology that keeps you up nights? I don't want to be leading here, but if you're thinking about trends in transit, what is the thing you're either most curious about seeing how it develops, or you're just like, this is an insane track that we're already on?
It's hard to predict, impossible to predict the future. The transportation things that keep me up are making sure that we don't end up like other, certainly metropolitan areas, either in the United States or around the world, where the economy doesn't grow or even shrinks because people can't get around. I have this corny notion that transportation assists a constitutional right in the First Amendment of association. We have a right of association. That means you get around to interact with people. You can't do it if you don't have a way to get around. Probably many countries that don't believe in rights of association, one of the ways they can limit how their population gets around is by having a non-functioning transportation system. You just don't maintain the roads. People can't travel. People can't get around. People can't see each other. So again, it's probably overstated, but it is the way I see the importance of transportation, that not just growing, but maintaining the system is something I hope we don't give up or give short shrift to.
It seems like there's a little bit of a flip side there that you're gesturing at, which I get. is, were there areas where you worry that like a ball might have been dropped during your, long time sort of either chairing transportation or in there? Like, is there a reason that you would be worried that there might be that sort of trajectory?
I'm not so worried about that. These are major projects I identified earlier, but let me be optimistic. And I know this may cause some differing reactions. Sometimes not proceeding with a project saves you, you don't know how much, but instinct can tell you significant amounts. Sometimes not pursuing projects is okay also. And I'm thinking principally about the Olympics we did not have, which we'll never know the pain avoidance and the cost avoidance. But to me, it's clear that the Commonwealth, certainly the city of Boston, avoided impacts, physical impacts, infrastructure impacts, and financial impacts that really would not have been well spent. So sometimes we are better off when these things don't happen.
Thanks again to Representative Bill Straus for joining me on the podcast. I'm Jennifer Smith, our producer is Claire Wigglesworth, and thank you so much for listening this year and every year. We hope the podcast is keeping you company over the holidays, whether you listen with family or use it to hide from them. And here is our plug. Commonwealth Beacon is in the final stretch of our Newsmatch campaign, so from now until December 31st, which is rapidly approaching, if we hit a $50,000 end-of-year fundraising target, we get bonus funding to do more journalism. You can head over to CommonWealthBeacon.org and click on the donate link if you want to help us get there. But for now, leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this if you want to help other folks find us. Email codcast@CommonWealthBeacon.org if you want to get in touch directly. Do you have holiday opinions I should know about? Let me know. And we'll be back next week.